Hi, can everyone hear me? All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Jennifer Jett. I'm an editor at the New York Times here and also the first vice president at the FCC. Thank you again for coming. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please silence your phones, although you should feel free to tweet as much as you like. We're at FCCHK is our Twitter account. I'd also like to tell you about some events we have coming up. We have an action-packed couple of weeks, just to give you a small sampling. Tomorrow we have a club lunch, a panel discussion on press freedom in China, as well as how China is influencing the media in other countries. And that features speakers from the Foreign Correspondents Club of China and Reporters Without Borders. And then on Thursday, we have a club lunch featuring Dilip Sinha, India's former ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, and he'll be discussing the current state of the UN Security Council. Saturday, of course, is our 4th annual journalism conference. That is a highlight of our year. It's a day-long event with a wide range of speakers and workshops, so be sure to take a look at the program. And then next week we have events related to Art Basel and a dinner featuring Alan Restbridger, the former editor-in-chief of The Guardian. And that's not even everything we have, so seriously, just like take a few minutes after the lunch today, go through your email, check the website. You're gonna find something that you like. So lots coming up. But for today, we have James Griffiths, a senior producer at CNN International and author of the new book, The Great Firewall of China, How to Build and Control an Alternative Version of the Internet. I'll just get right to it. Let's please welcome James Griffiths.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. On September 14th, 1987, a team of Chinese and Western scientists huddled around a clunky white terminal in a Beijing computer lab and got ready to send the first ever email from China to the rest of the world. Wan Yunfeng, a professor at the snappily named Chinese Institute for Computer Applications of the State Commission of Machine Industry, wrote the email in English. "Across the Great Wall," he typed, "we can reach every corner in the world. This is the first electronic mail supposed to be sent from China into the international scientific networks." He added his own name and that of 12 colleagues and pressed send, the culmination of years of work by teams across the globe. Nothing happened. Error. It would take another 6 days before the email was finally delivered, but history had been made. The internet was slow to catch on in China. Even 5 years later in 1994, only around 2,000 people, most of them academics, could get online. But change came rapidly. Within 2 years, the country's first commercial internet service launched and computer ownership exploded nationwide. Online bulletin boards began popping up on university servers, bringing with them discussion of sensitive topics and the sharing of forbidden information. While they may have been slow to realize the potential of the internet had for fostering social change, both the party and its detractors quickly cottoned on. Speaking in the late 90s, one activist said that if the students had email during the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, student leaders in different cities could have been united. The news of the massacre could have spread overnight, he said. The authorities couldn't block the news. It could have been a very different situation. The same thought was probably on the mind of Premier Li Peng when on February 1st, 1996, he signed State Council Order 195, temporary regulations governing computer information networks and the internet. Within a year, Wired magazine would coin the term the Great Firewall, and ever since then, the internet in China has been characterized by one thing: censorship. So what is the Great Firewall? Internet censorship in China occurs at two main levels: internationally, as traffic passes from the global web into the country, and locally, within Chinese internet service providers and tech firms. The first level is what we traditionally call the Great Firewall, which is now something of an umbrella term for all online censorship in China. Despite this, the two types of censorship operate very differently. The international level really is a firewall. It inspects and blocks traffic as it goes in and out of China. It's how the censors can tell if you type in the URL twitter.com, they can tell that you're trying to visit a banned website and block you. And it can also inspect use deep packet inspection to look at the actual web pages people are visiting, so that if something is not on a blacklist but is featuring content that the censors don't particularly want people to look at, in theory the system will catch it, flag it, and get it blocked. But this part of the firewall is perhaps the most familiar to people and the most kind of iconic, but it's also not the part which actually affects most people in China. And I encourage people to think about it from this perspective. If you're a native English speaker, which a lot of people in this room will be, and you're in the UK, how often would you check Chinese language websites for news? Probably never. Even with China's huge state media apparatus publishing in English, I doubt many people in Bournemouth are looking on Chinese websites to see if they're publishing something the British government is censoring. People stay within the walls of their own internet, and people especially stay within the walls of their own language. And so the important censorship in China happens at the national level, and this happens within Chinese internet companies, and it's done largely by private actors, by people employed by companies like Weibo or WeChat or Tencent. And that is one of the reasons that the firewall is so successful. The real censorship, the stuff that affects people day to day, is what happens within the borders of the Great Firewall. More than 800 million internet users in China. Even if the Great Firewall blocked every single piece of content from outside the country, that's still almost 1 billion people the government has to worry about. And so in order to control those people, it's passed dozens of laws criminalizing all sorts of content: separatism, terrorism, political dissent, porn and sexuality, and so on. And then it's put the burden of policing those laws onto the private companies. And this has two distinct advantages. Both the government saves a huge amount of money by not having to employ the censors itself, and also it creates a incentive that trends towards greater censorship. If you are a Chinese internet company, you don't necessarily have a blacklist, you don't know exactly what to censor, and therefore you have to guess what the government won't like, and you tend to trend in the direction of greater censorship because the potential price of getting something wrong and failing to censor something that should have been censored is very high. And then the way that the Chinese internet is structured also assists in this. The kind of protectionist environment that the firewall has created by blocking a lot of the major international competitors has boosted these Chinese internet companies and assisted them in growing, to be huge companies both within China and some of them around the world. And then the means of getting past the firewall have weakened year on year. I'm sure nearly anyone in this country that's been to China has used a VPN to get around the firewall. That's somewhat possible to do. It varies from time to time. It's much easier for us to do because we are able to leave China at times, download new VPN software, update our VPN software, and go back into the country. It's much harder if you are a normal Chinese internet user who doesn't necessarily leave the country, doesn't have access to the open internet, and doesn't have either a foreign credit card or a domestic credit card that they want attached to any VPN bill. There's also the problem that the government has shown itself fully capable of blocking VPNs when it needs to. For example, during the recent NPC in the last 2 weeks, VPN use was significantly hampered. Someone that was reviewing the book messaged me to say that all 4 of their VPNs had gone down when they were trying to send off the review. And this just shows that when the government wants to block these things, it can. And we can talk about why it doesn't always block VPNs later if people are interested. And so the Great Firewall isn't 100% effective, and it doesn't need to be. The narrative of how the Great Firewall works and how it functions is somewhat flawed because it focuses on how content is censored and whether any individual piece of content gets through, and not at the actual functioning of the firewall. And so, sorry, I forgot to set that joke up properly. But it's through the years of the firewall, there have been various things that have been raised as the potential solution to getting past censorship. Lots of these things can be successful in terms of getting individual pieces of content past the firewall. Every so often we do see a topic that isn't censored, or some other new means of getting past the firewall which is effective. Most of these are effective at sharing content. That's well and good, and it is a positive story whenever content is shared within China. The blockchain has been used to uncensor certain things, most recently a manifesto written by some Chinese feminists. But the problem is that the firewall isn't designed to block content, it's designed to block solidarity. It's designed to prevent people from organizing about the things that they know, not designed to prevent them knowing those things in the first place. And the kind of example that I always raise is that in the 90s, anyone who would be politically active and wanted to be politically active was fully aware of what happened in Tiananmen. This has been censored in the decades since, and we now have a generation of young Chinese people who may not be aware of Tiananmen, but their parents and their grandparents were fully aware that this happened. It was covered widely in China. It was reasonably open at the time. That knowledge is not in itself enough to make people take to the streets and make people protest and make people try and bring down the government. Falun Gong was widely spread throughout China before the crackdown started and before it was censored. Knowledge of Falun Gong was not in itself enough to make people want to go and protest. The important thing that the firewall does is it prevents organizing, it prevents solidarity. Since its inception, the party's understood that the biggest threat to it is an alternative structure, is an alternative space for people to affect political change and for people to organize and try and overthrow the party. We often see these supposed approval ratings of President Xi Jinping, and they tend to be very high, but they're high for one reason, because there is no alternative. There is no opposition candidate in China. There is no opposition party, and the firewall is one of the things that is successful in preventing this. And the doctrine behind the thinking behind the firewall is known as cyber sovereignty, and this is something that has been bubbling under the surface for about 10 years now and has really kind of come to the fore with Xi Jinping. And this sees internet censorship not as a speech issue, not as a human rights issue, but as a sovereignty issue, as a security issue. And under this doctrine, the rights of the Chinese government to censor the internet is exactly the same as its right to police its national borders and to conduct foreign affairs. And this is now a doctrine which is being spread around the world. This is from a report by Freedom House which came out late last year, which shows a kind of general decline in internet freedom around the world. Part of that decline is driven by China. China actively sells people telecoms capabilities, it sells the tech and the routers and the various other solutions for conducting censorship, and it also sells the kind of political thinking and the legal material for doing this censorship. So we've seen in Vietnam recently they passed a cybersecurity law which is heavily based on China's own and comes after various Vietnamese officials have been recorded going to China for conferences and for meetings. In Russia there was several laws 2 weeks ago in front of the Duma which are about transforming Russia from its own very particular type of censored internet into something that is much more a mirror of the Chinese internet. This is very actively assisted by China, by Beijing. I write in the book a lot about Uganda, which is a country which has had a huge amount of protests where the internet was used for organizing and has copied the Chinese tactic of blacking out the internet at key stages. Following major protests in 2016, officials openly said that they were going to Beijing to learn from the Chinese about censoring their domestic internet. And since then, we've seen a massive escalation in the type of laws in order to control the internet. And this comes at a time when global confidence in the internet is at an all-time low. I don't think anyone in this room would disagree that something needs to be done in terms of how information is spread on social media. With the events in Christchurch last week, that kind of became more apparent than ever. Skepticism in the internet and skepticism in big tech companies is welcome and is growing, but it is coming at a time when China is actively trying to promote an alternative model of how the internet should look. And the danger is not only in autocracies and semi-autocracies, but also in democratic countries, that as governments attempt to rein in the internet or attempt to, add some regulation to these huge tech companies, that they trend in the direction of too much security, and they trend in a direction of reducing user freedom instead of promoting it. And this is a real danger, and we've seen this in various countries before. The UK is currently considering a so-called porn pass that people will have to apply to look at adult content online. Australia has been down this road before. They eventually had to abandon it after a leaked list of websites that should have been blocked under this adult content law was found to include whistleblowing websites, gambling websites, websites about LGBT issues and things like that. The tendency for governments to trend in the direction of greater control is a very strong one, and it is not limited to autocracies. And so we currently have two models of the internet. The information will set you free, hyper-libertarian model, which has been advanced by Silicon Valley since the 90s, and is in the process of failing, and is facing great challenges, and the hyper-controlled Chinese model, where the government is the kind of last judge and jury for what content should be published online. And both of these models are unattractive for their own reasons, and what we currently don't have is a third model or a direction that we might head in, which assists users and promotes greater transparency and promotes greater rights online. And that's part of what the argument of my book is, that we need to build a new, if we are to fix the internet in China, we need to build a new and better internet outside of China. And without doing that, and we're heading in the same direction and going around the same circle over and over and over, we risk heading in the direction of greater control and greater censorship. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much. So, did you guys have any questions that you wanted to start with, or?
Sure. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why it's in China's interest not to sort of blanket ban all VPNs at all times.
Yeah, so the fact that VPNs work to circumvent the Great Firewall and to circumvent internet censorship is kind of it's a side effect of how they work. Everyone's familiar with using a VPN to connect to a school network or an office network. By doing that, it encrypts your traffic, and that is something which helps you get through the firewall. But because of the primary reason of what VPNs are used for, that makes them difficult to block all of the time, because the government can block them on a protocol level, and that's what it does during things like NBC, or if we've got the Tiananmen anniversary coming up, I think we can expect that all the VPNs will be blocked during the Tiananmen anniversary. But doing that, it also affects commercial VPN. It also affects office VPNs, and it can really disrupt communications. Banks really don't like it when you stop them being able to use their VPNs. Embassies aren't particularly fond of you stopping them using their VPNs, and so there is a kind of inbuilt lobby against doing this. There have been noises, and there does seem to be kind of heading in the direction of something like an approved list of VPNs, which will be able to do those kind of harmless services, but won't allow you to get through the firewall. We have to kind of wait and see if that actually works, because if I was a bank or a foreign embassy, I'm not sure I would want to put all of my sensitive traffic through an officially Chinese government licensed service. That doesn't seem super secure. So this is always going to be a tension, and the I think it's a good example of why the government doesn't need to block things 100% of the time, because it can still block them when it needs to. So if the VPNs were being used for organizing something on the ground, if there was an attempted color revolution or something in China, it could block them tomorrow. That they can be used by a bunch of Westerners to go on Facebook while they're in China isn't as important, and so it doesn't feel the need to block it all the time.
I thought it was interesting what you said about the need for a third model and how we don't really have one, but could you tell us a bit more about what you think that might look like, or what components we would need?
Yeah, I mean, one of the advantages of writing a book as a journalist rather than an academic or a policy thinker is that you can kind of just point at things and say that they're bad without having to have solutions. So I'm not going to pretend that I have a very coherent solution for this, but, you know, to give an example of recent kind of behavior we've seen from the big tech firms, you know, there have been kind of calls for you know, censorship of certain people online and you know, and of controlling certain content online by these firms, and some of them have done this, but they've done this in a way that has no kind of consistency and has no transparency. You know, they say that they're enforcing their rules of their terms of service, but that was, you know, those terms of service were violated years ago and weren't enforced, and why they're being enforced now. They're generally enforced off the back of a load of media coverage, and, you know, and we need a system which is more accountable, is more transparent, and the kind of problem we face is that often the kind of solution that's suggested as, you know, this is how we'll fix these tech companies, or, you know, this is how we'll fix Facebook, is people are encouraged to just leave it, you know, talk with your wallet and don't give your data to these services, don't give your money to them. And I don't think that's a particularly effective method, because there isn't an alternative service for a lot of these things. You know, I could leave Facebook tomorrow, but there isn't, there isn't a service that I can then easily use to connect with my family across the world, and I can, you know, there certainly isn't one service that my grandparents and my nieces are on. You know, this is something which has infected our lives, and so to kind of fix it, it needs to involve perhaps we need to kind of rethink how we deal with these issues.
That reminds me, I got an email this morning saying that Google Plus was shutting down and that I should take all my information off it, and I don't even remember using it.
Yeah.
But questions from the audience? Sherry?
Hi, I'm Sheridan Prasso. I work for Bloomberg, and I'm quite fond of this issue. I've gone to Africa to report on China's export of its surveillance technology there, and so in this idea of exploring a possible third model, I wonder if you could discuss maybe some of the different moves that Europe is doing and how that all fits into the possibility of a third model.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about, so a term that's often used is the splinter net, which is this kind of, as the internet becomes various different models, with China's being the kind of most distinct, but then there's also discussion now of a European model, you know, based off the back of GDPR, which is a privacy protection legislation. Europe is moving in a much more interventionist direction. I think the problem it's going to face is that all of the major tech firms are American. How much influence European legislators can bring to bear on Facebook and Google at a kind of reinvention of those platforms type level, I don't think it's really possible. You know, people talk of nationalizing tech companies, and, you know, how do you nationalize Facebook in multiple different countries? What does that look like? You know, and then also these companies are kind of already fighting a rearguard action against this. I don't think it's a coincidence that as people are talking about breaking up various tech companies, Facebook suddenly announces this plan to integrate all of its services and to wipe out the distinctions between its brands. You know, it's very easy to see at the moment how you would separate Instagram from WhatsApp from Facebook. 6 months down the line, when they're all integrated together and it's one thing called Facebook, it might be a lot harder. And, you know, I think it will be very interesting to see how Europe deals with this, but because it has had influence in the past on, you know, right to be forgotten and things like that, but that's very much in how they interact with European consumers, how much influence it can have in order to kind of encourage the companies to behave in a better way globally, remains to be seen. Europe, unfortunately, also has rather a lot of other things on its plate, and this might not be the other priority, and whereas the tech firms are clearly taking this a priority and are, you know, working very hard to guard against it.
One thing I forgot to mention is to please identify yourself and your organization. Yes, right in the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm To Hanshi from Finance Asia. Over the past 12 months, has censorship of the internet in China gotten worse? And if it has, please share some details.
Yes, it's gotten worse. It's mainly gotten worse because it's been getting worse for years. There are occasional kind of blips when it seems to improve, but the general trend has been downwards. What's been really interesting in the last 12 months has been the kind of, I talk about this in the book, the expansion of the Great Firewall and the kind of exporting of it, not just in terms of exporting it to other countries and helping them control their internets, but also in controlling how China is discussed online outside of China. So we've seen a large number of Chinese Twitter users, mainly kind of dissidents based in China who use Twitter, have reported having visits from the police and been told to delete their accounts or delete their tweets. Others have just disappeared from Twitter entirely. And this is kind of showing that the tolerance of this area, which once was pretty much ignored by the Chinese government, they kind of saw it perhaps rightly as a circle of people who largely talked to each other and didn't have much effect on the conversation around China. The tolerance for that has completely gone away, and the government has really, basically it will not brook dissidents anywhere they act. And this also affects the way that Western companies and Western users behave. So there was the big story last year of various international airlines and hotel chains being forced to change how they refer to Hong Kong or Tibet or Taiwan. That's a kind of exporting of Chinese political correctness, for lack of a better term. That the willingness of the censors to control how the conversation is had overseas has increased massively, as well as just a kind of general escalating crackdown at home.
We'll do the two people at that table.
My name is Johan Nylander from Swedish business daily Dagens Industri. Often from a Western perspective, we say that Chinese are behind the Great Firewall. They have no Facebook, they have no Google. But at the same time, what we're seeing at the moment is some of the world's most interesting and most innovative internet companies are actually coming from China. There's no equivalence in the West to WeChat, the world's highest valued internet companies, the owners of TikTok. So how come in this hyper-controlled society that innovation can still flourish in as some say, in a better way than it does in the West?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to look at within, obviously the Chinese internet is not a monolith, and the kind of market is not a monolith, but it's interesting to look at where the innovation is, and it tends to be in the categories within China that are competitive. So messaging was very competitive for a long time before WeChat kind of emerged as the conqueror, and that really spurred WeChat to be more innovative and to really challenge this area. Search is an area that has not had much competition since Google exited, basically, and I would not particularly describe Baidu Search as an innovative or particularly advanced product. But it's undoubtable that the success of Chinese internet companies is not solely down to the firewall, and I think it's a mistake sometimes to over-egg how much protectionism plays a role. It certainly does play a role in some areas, but it's not the only issue. Innovation has been an important one. And I think some of that is due to the unique nature of the Chinese market, that this is a country that the size of it and the amount of money flowing around does encourage competition. You have the big three competing in a similar ways that Google, Amazon, and Facebook do in the West. And that, this kind of, it's not just a unique internet, it's a unique market, and it's a unique situation, and that encourages it there. What I think is interesting, though, is that a lot of these companies, TikTok being the major exception, a lot of these companies have struggled to succeed overseas. WeChat, in particular, spent a huge amount of money. They had Lionel Messi as a spokesman for a while, huge amount of money trying to attract foreign users, and basically retreated from that a few years ago because of how little success they were getting. So, innovation happens, but it happens within a little bit of a bubble, and it doesn't always pan out and turn into international success.
Elizabeth Doncourt, the International Republican Institute. I just wanted to go back to the exploring the third model again, if possible. Sorry, and I will buy your book.
If you have difficult questions, tell me you're going to buy the book. That's a great way to put me up.
But I'm just wondering your thoughts on how international forum, like the international the ICG, the International Governance Internet Forum, sorry, I've forgotten the name, in the role that civil society organizations might be able to play in helping foster more transparency and accountability, because it is something that they do at a governance level around the globe and within their own nation.
Yeah, civil society obviously has a huge role to play in this. Internet governance is unfortunately one of those things that is incredibly important and affects how we all act day to day, and is one of those things that hardly anyone pays attention to unless you operate in that sphere. I talk about in the book the International Telecommunications Union, which is a major UN body where China has been massively increasing influence in terms of how you're trying to shape future internet legislation and telecoms legislation. The people fighting to get back against this are generally civil society. Industry has a certain role, but sometimes its hands are tied about how much it wants to lobby against certain things, and governments, there are also other issues in that thing. China, as a kind of example of how powerful civil society can perhaps be in these issues, China lobbies very hard to get things put into intergovernmental bodies like the ITU, where rather than things like ICANN, where civil society groups have a much bigger stake and much bigger say. I think some of the very good internet civil society groups they've gotten better, but they've been less good on talking about problems in the West and talking about issues, things done by Western governments, particularly things done by Silicon Valley. That is improving a lot, but a lot of these groups receive funding from Silicon Valley. They are very cozy with these companies, and I think it's taken us to reach a bit of a breaking point for them to be actively lobbying for change within them.
Genevieve?
Genevieve Hilton from BASF. Thanks very much, and I'll definitely buy your book. I wanted to hear a little bit more about you alluded to it briefly, about the automation side of VPNs. So you talked about financial industries. What about industrial automation? What would be the potential impact, current impact, and then potential in the future if, say, things are to get even more restrictive, on things like supply chains automatically interacting with each other at the back end between China and the rest of the world?
This is a bit outside of my kind of sphere of expertise, so I'll try to kind of answer what I can talk about. But the potential is great, but also, and I think this is why we would see an alternative model presented by China as, you are a big supply company, don't you want to use our government-approved VPN and not risk it getting blocked by the firewall every June 4th? That's perhaps the thin end of the wedge in terms of promoting this as a widespread thing. That potentially will butt up against banks and embassies at the other end, but it is quite easy to see how this could be pushed. And China in the past, it hasn't seemed to care too much about the effects of censorship on the economy. And, this maybe is something that changes as the economy slows down and as sensitivities around it increase. But, there was at last year's MPC, or perhaps 2 years ago, there was a proposal put forward by a member of the MPC, which was designed to reduce censorship, and the reason they gave was that a lot of Chinese scientists and engineers and stuff were having trouble finding scientific information or papers and participating in the global scientific community, and this was presented as something that was potentially hurting China economically. And that was proposed, it was put forward, and then it was censored, and it was taken off the Chinese internet. Discussion around it was deleted. It was the message was pretty clear that we are willing to take this hit because, from our perspective, the potential political hit is much greater if we do ease up on censorship in any of these areas.
Edith?
Edith Terry, I'm going to buy your book too. So my question is, you talk about 3 ways forward. Isn't there a 4th way where China would begin to set the domain protocols, domain names, and the whole hierarchy? In the history of the development of the internet, DARPA was the original driver, and then isn't it ICANN that became the sort of the authority that registered all of the domain names? And so that's the liberal architecture. Isn't the 4th way that China sort of create its own set of its own hierarchy, its own control system. So you have the splinter net, you have the liberal net. Your third was sort of some new civil society informed internet, but the fourth would be a rival system. Wouldn't it be? What are the prospects for that?
Yeah, I think we get a bit lost in terms of numbering them, but yeah, certainly the Chinese model is advancing in that direction, and China is doing this in two ways. It's building up the domestic infrastructure to kind of govern its own internet and to run its own internet, as is Russia, and there were laws passed, they're in the process of going through the Duma and going to Putin on kind of walling off the Russian internet from the rest of the world, including the DNS system, which is what ICANN runs presently. The internet is very, very, as a kind of infrastructure and as a piece of technology, the internet remains very, very US dominated. And countries, particularly China and Russia, but plenty of other countries, have very legitimate concerns about this and want to see this changed. A lot of the time the reason it hasn't changed is because when it comes down to it, places like the European Union decide that actually we'd rather stick with the Americans and have American governance than risk opening the door to more kind of Chinese and Russian governance. But undoubtedly this is the direction they want to head in, and they're doing that presently at bodies like the ITU. There's a large Chinese influence at ICANN now. Various standards bodies are increasingly kind of seeing proposals being put forward by Chinese engineers and Chinese tech companies. Obviously these companies have a complete right to participate in these areas, and China has a right to influence global internet policy as kind of one of the largest internet countries in the world. But what's concerning is that tends to be one major direction they want to push this policy in.
We had two more questions at this table. Yeah.
Hi, my name is John Antweiler. I'm retired. I very much enjoyed your talk. The question I have is, excuse me, the difference between the internet and the World Wide Web. Are we really talking about changes to the basic architecture, which is the internet, or censorship and rules around the World Wide Web?
Both. So the World Wide Web, which celebrated its 30th anniversary last week, is the internet for most people. It's what you interact with on your browser. It's how we visit websites and how we interact with most services. But and China is obviously attempting to influence that. That's kind of what the Great Firewall has the most effect on. But it is also, as we kind of touched on in the previous question, it is also working to affect how the internet works, how the structure and the DNS system works, and how naming works in terms of other issues. And that's where we really see a push towards the splinter net. That's where the kind of way that this technology has acted since it was invented could potentially really change, is if the internet in these countries changes rather than the World Wide Web in these countries changes. And we already have several versions of the World Wide Web. Currently we still mainly have one version of the internet, but that is heading towards splintering.
In the back, and then this table.
Hi, Steve Bernstein. I'm not a journalist and I'm not retired, but congratulations. Question about Hong Kong and Macau, the effect of the firewall, and maybe longer term, what if China kind of positioning themselves in a certain way, and how it affects people here in Macau?
The firewall does affect us because it affects the conversation that happens within China about Hong Kong and Macau. And one thing I did kind of want to talk about in the book, but I didn't find space for, because unfortunately this is a very, very large topic and you can kind of get lost in it. But propaganda obviously is a major part of censorship, presenting an alternative version of stories, and also having, what we've seen in China is that as these conversations are censored and as kind of anger on various issues is censored, one of the things that's often used as a release is nationalism, and this is potentially something that has a great effect on Hong Kong as somewhere on the periphery of China. That nationalism can potentially a big push towards retaining territory and retaining sovereignty can have a real effect on how the government thinks about Hong Kong and how our own government responds to China. I get asked, or I have been asked at previous events, whether I think censorship will happen in Hong Kong, whether I think the firewall comes to Hong Kong. I don't necessarily think the firewall will come. I don't think they will cut off Facebook and Twitter. I think these services are so ingrained that it would maybe be too provocative to do that. But we are already seeing limits on speech in the city. These are things that will have to be enforced online, that will require a certain degree of greater regulation. And as we saw kind of last year with various issues involving the FCC, the freedoms that we've enjoyed for many years are shrinking, and some of them are shrinking for the same reasons that the firewall exists, in terms of organizing on alternative structures and alternative ideas not being welcome in the new China.
Yes, those freedoms are shrinking fast. I'm Joel Lakin, IPPF, Independent Power Producers. We're involved with all kinds of energy and power all over the world. So I'm on a conversation about a couple of months ago, maybe only 6 weeks ago, with one of our people involved with nuclear technology, I think in Shanghai. And I received a kind of cryptic message through another forum. I don't use WeChat or WhatsApp, but somebody gave me the message, please don't call and discuss this on the phone again. The point system, the idea that you get enough negative points, Big Brother won't let you take a plane ride, or much less get on a train. You want to expand on that? Because it seems the chill is already here, big time.
Yeah, so the social credit system, which is important to know, is a proposed system and is not something that's in place in most of China. There's a couple of pilot programs, and there are a couple of kind of related systems which are working in terms of transport and certain things like that. But what I think the social credit system, which in a kind of very simplified form would assign you points for positive behavior and potentially lose you points for negative behavior, I think that could have a very large effect on how people interact with censorship in China, because at the moment the system is mostly a top-down system. Self-censorship happens, but it happens within a system where it's controlled. So sometimes you might not bother posting something because you think it's going to get deleted, and that's arguably self-censorship, and self-censorship undoubtedly happens within the media. But what the social credit system can push us towards is even greater self-censorship, because the risks of doing something that is then deemed to be inappropriate are so much higher. If you're a kind of precocious teenager who wants to complain about the government on Weibo and doesn't really care that those posts get deleted, at the moment you can do that. No one really sees it, but it doesn't affect you too much unless they might delete your account. If you're really, really troublesome, you might get a visit from the police and someone will try and frighten you. Under the social credit system, potentially the costs of that are raised even higher. Does having your Weibo account deleted, does that affect your social credit score? If it affects your social credit score, and the system we've seen proposed, we've seen that your relationships can also affect your social credit score. So if my social credit score goes down because my Weibo account was deleted, does that then affect my parents' social credit score? Does that affect their ability to run a business, their ability to travel? Various ripples out that the cost of posting anything online or of interacting online or behaving in that way that might affect my score are so much higher that you probably don't bother from day one. And so this is, I think, a very effective, potentially effective new form of censorship which could kind of rewrite how people behave online in China.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. We had one over here.
I'm Jin Chang, from a retired journalist from the Singapore Straits Times. I just want to ask what kind of impact on the Chinese people have all these kinds of censorship been impacting on the Chinese people? Just now you said about the social credit system. Are we going to experience experience a state much worse than the 1984 prophecies made by George Orwell. And then looking back, after being cut off from the world internet's information pool, what impact on the Chinese people, on their behavior, on their character do you discern?
So yeah, what impact does it have? I mean, this is, we often talk about, you hear people talk about the longevity of the Communist Party and kind of what they've managed to weather every storm and, go through every crisis and come out stronger. And I think the censorship apparatus is not the only reason that happens, but it is a very effective one. As I talked earlier about not having alternative systems and not having alternative bodies, or not having even a venue or a forum to kind of criticize the government or to talk about an alternative system, that in itself empowers the government and strengthens it. And I think that's probably the biggest effect that it's had. I talk about in the book the Chinese Democracy Party, which was a very kind of brief, short-lived party in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and that kind of came up around the time when China was joining the WTO, and there was this kind of forced openness as China attempted to court the West. And that was perhaps the last time that we've had, an alternative body in China, something that you could see potentially in the future, maybe fighting an election. There is no alternative structure, and censorship is a big reason for that. In terms of the effect the social credit system could have, yes, we are moving in a really potentially a frightening direction with this. It is not something the Chinese government has rather than that, they've had a desire to do this before. We've seen this in the past in China of kind of mass surveillance and of kind of people policing their neighbors and things like this. And some of what's happened is the technology has caught up with those desires, and the potential for that to spread throughout the country and the effect that could have on people's lives are very, very great.
I think I will end it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
The book, The Great Firewall of China, is available from Swindon Books in Hong Kong, as well as from Amazon and zbooks.net. So check that out if you like. We also have a gift for you. It's presented in this great new FCC tote bag, which is also available for sale downstairs. And thank you again very much, James.
Thank you.
Thank you.